I'm John Buchanan. Now, it might just be me, so apologies if that's the case, but if I was to say to you time stretching as a word, do you think about audio? Because I do. I think about the idea that time stretching is a processor that we apply to bits of audio to manipulate its time. What we don't tend to do is to think about time stretching in terms of MIDI, but the subject of this week's episode is all about the ways in which we can work with MIDI using time stretching. And some of those are really straightforward, and others might be slightly hidden features that you might not have come across before. Now, before we get too deeply into time stretching MIDI, we need to have some MIDI. So should we start there? What I've done is to prepare 3 instruments, 2 of which are drum kits, one of which is called Green Lights, one of which is called East Side Dreams, aspirational, and the last one of which is just an upright bass from the Studio Bass Instruments, which is rapidly becoming one of my favourite instruments, I have to say. Anyway, let's start with Green Lights. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new region, but rather than this being a pattern region, it's just going to be a regular MIDI region. I'm going to start with a single bar. I know it's like Logic 101, isn't it? It's fun though. This is always quite a fun way to create new beat loops. And you'll find that if you start with a Drum Machine Designer kit, you'll find that the names of the instruments are mapped down the left-hand side, which makes life much more straightforward. And just while I'm talking to you, I'm going to program a beat loop. So we're going to start with a kick drum here. And what I have a chance to do, of course, is not just to place my first note, but potentially to adjust its velocity too. And the advantage of doing that early is it means that all subsequent hits will be put in at the same velocity that you place the first one at. So now I can come back to my pencil tool and I might decide that I want a pattern that sort of does this a bit. I don't know, maybe something like that would be fun. And then we can put in some hats as well. Oh, that's quite nice. Let's have that on the very last 16th. And maybe for now, I just want to hear this second kick. No, I don't. I don't want to hear it again. Okay, well, here's our beat loop. Just the 1 bar, put a cycle round it. Logic 101. And there's 1 bar of beats. Okay, well, that's sort of fine and it works quite nicely. I've talked about time stretching. Okay, well, let's first of all look at a couple of things that we can do with our beat loop. Before we even think about time stretching it, what I'm actually going to do is to double its length. I'm going to make it 2 bars long, and what I'm going to do is to glue those 2 regions together. Now what I've got, obviously, is the same pattern that's happening twice. Now, the first way in which it's possible for me to time stretch anything from a drum perspective would be simply to, I don't know, let's duplicate it down to this second kit for a moment, where we can hear it on a different collection of sounds. And if I wanted to time stretch it, I can just hover over the bottom right-hand corner, where of course the default icon is going to allow me to adjust its length. But if I hold down Option at the same time, that icon will change to become the stretching icon. And what that means is that if I simply just drag this out to twice of its original length, this version of our beat loop will become half time. In other words, it's exactly the same beat loop, it's just that all of those notes have been stretched to occupy twice the time, and therefore they'll play back at half the speed. So that's one thing that I could do. I'm actually going to delete that region for a moment. And I'm going to come back to my original beat loop, which is up here. And what we're going to do is now look at a time stretching method, not for a whole region, but for part of it. To show you what I mean, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select an area here, just to show you the area we're going to be working on. I want to focus on everything that happens in those 2 beats. So from the beginning of beat 2 all the way to the end of beat 4, but I don't want to move anything on either side of those 2 beats. Well, the best way to do that is for me to use a function called time handles. And that exists within the piano roll editor, and it's in the functions menu, and it's here. Time handles is right here. And what I'm then going to do is to come back and redraw the area that I want to time stretch, to time process, to time handle, if you like. The verb to time handle. No one's learning that in school. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to draw over that area again. And what will happen is that even though you can see I've slightly missed the start point and I've slightly missed the end point, when I release, Logic will figure out, based on my snap value, that of course I meant to go from the beginning of beat 2 to the beginning of beat 4. And now what I'm in a position to do is to use these markers as a means to time handle the area around it. In other words, these act as handles for wherever I want to then place my MIDI. And what that means is that if I then switch time handles off, I could duplicate beat 1, put it back on beat 3, and now what we've got is a little double time section. And that's quite nice. And what I could also do would be to say, okay, well, actually, I like that idea. Again, I'm going to use time handles. And again, I'm going to select beats 2 to 4, this time of the second bar, but this time I'm going to squeeze them all into beat 3 instead of beat 2. And that's going to give me a little bit of variation. And maybe this time what I'll do when I turn time handles off is I'll take beat 4 and I'll copy it to beat 2. And that way I'm still getting my backbeat snare. It sounds like I'm just like the ultimate double kick drummer. But of course, all I've done here is to just create a couple of double time sections. Now, with these variations, if I was then to take this beat loop back down to here and then to repeat my trick of time stretching the whole region, this is now the second beat loop at mostly half speed, but with those variations, which have also now been turned into half speed sections. So in other words, the bits that I've turned into double speed will now be back to their normal speed. Shall I just stop talking and press play? And with the first beat loop as well, I think that could be quite interesting. And that is quite interesting. And of course, I could just keep going. What I've got now, because of these bits of MIDI, is a whole series of bits of MIDI, which I can now re-time handle. So in other words, I could glue those two things together. I could now go back in with my time handles all over again. And maybe I might decide that just the second time round in bar 3, for instance, what I really want to do just for a moment would be to just speed up the first beat of that bar, which I could do kind of like that. And that again is going to just give me a different kind of rhythm for just that one moment, which is not being replicated in the second beat loop. Okay, so I'm definitely missing the kick drum that's happening halfway through that. But of course, just because I've time stretched a section doesn't mean that I can't add new notes. So I've just put that back in for a moment because I think we're going to need it. I think a little hat there on that beat might be a good idea as well. But again, all about variation. Okay, for a moment, what I'm going to do is to mute both of those. And what I'm going to do is to come back to my upright bass. So we've looked at the idea of time stretching on a kind of beat-based level, but what might happen when we start using pitched instruments as well? Well, again, what I've got a chance to do now is to start thinking about variation, things that I wouldn't necessarily think to play. I'm going to put in a bass line using this upright bass, and then what I'm going to do is to start thinking about ways that I can kind of wonk it out with time handles and with time stretching, just to create a pattern that I would probably never think to actually play. Okay, let's get in something which is going to feel a bit syncopated. I don't know what that was, but I'm going to now just try and do that to a metronome. Okay, what I'm also going to do is just quantize that in 16th notes for a second. Okay, well that is sufficiently syncopated, I think. You might be wondering why a couple of notes aren't speaking. What happens with this particular bass patch, and one of the reasons I like it so much, is that if you play it at low velocities, notes overlap and they bend. Too much of a good thing there, but nevertheless, the lower velocities effectively means that, for example, here at the end of bar 2, I'm not really hearing that note because it's just kind of sliding down there instead. Okay, so back to time handles. Well, what could I do here? Well, it kind of feels a little bit like it might be interesting, completely at random, again, to focus on a couple of kind of intervening beats, maybe. What might happen, for instance, if I was to select, beat 2 of bar 3 all the way through to that point in bar 4. Again, I think it's going to snap, which means that if I came back to here, what we'd get would be a really kind of rapid collection of bends and notes happening there. What does that sound like? Do you know what? With the drums, okay, I'd never played this part, and actually it doesn't sound quite right, but it nearly does. What I think I want is for this moment here to properly arrive on beat 4. And if that means that all of the timing of everything that happens before becomes a bit wonky, I don't think I necessarily mind. So what I'm going to do is to keep my time handles on, I'm going to extend it out that way, and I'm going to make that note arrive on beat 4. What does that do? Okay, and the other thing I'm really interested to know is what happens if it arrives on beat 1. Now again, remember, that isn't where it was to start with, but it's where I'm putting it now. Okay, I don't like that as much. We're going to go back to beat 4. And now what we've got is this kind of interesting, much faster little section leading to a gap before we then get our pickup at the end. The other thing I'm also really interested to know is what happens if we duplicate the whole lot, and this time we create a different fill the second time around. So I'm going to focus this time on this section where everything's a little bit quicker already. Again, I think time handles are already selected. So what I'm going to do now is to select all of these notes, and I'm going to go the other way. So what we get is this really rapid little fill happening here. Now you can see what happens with pitch notes. Anything that's included within the time handles, and in fact I've actually missed that. This one's in the wrong place, but I'll stick with it for now because you can see that two things happen. Firstly, as I adjust the left-hand edge, all of those notes stretch that way as I expect them to, but this last one, because it's included, in other words, because this note has started and therefore it's been included here, what we're going to find is that it goes the other way. It gets pulled in the direction of everything else going the other way. You can see it's just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, it's kind of irresistible. Should we just see what that sounds like for a moment? Well, it sounds nuts, but I wonder. and so on and so forth. By using these time handles and by using the idea of time stretching, what I can do is to take any part that I've actually played in and I can start manipulating things. And of course, if you're worried that you're going to do sort of permanent damage or you're going to create a time stretch you don't like, remember there are 99 stages of undo is the first thing to say. But the other thing you might do would be to say, okay, I'm going to program a core beat pattern to start with, and I'm going to copy it across to bar 32, somewhere out of the way. And that's your little key, that's your core rhythm. And if it turns out you want to go back to it at any stage, remember this isn't destructive, this is just MIDI. So what we've got is we've got our basic patterns, we've pushed them over there, we've copied them back to bar 1, and now we're in a position to go absolutely crazy, just effectively using the concept of time stretching as a means to engage with variation and creating fills and patterns and rhythms and syncopation and things you probably just wouldn't play when the record light is on and you're actually just trying to play against the metronome. It's a really interesting way of introducing some variation.